Hi, in this video we show you some examples of the async await syntax. This syntax was introduced to JavaScript in ECMAScript 2017, and it basically allows you to make your code look more synchronous, even if you are doing some asynchronous tasks. For example, when you request data from an external API. So let's get started. Okay, so first let's create a very simple page that we can use for our examples. So let's create a new file called index.html, a new folder called JS, and in there a file called main.js, and that's all we need. Now we will need some basic boilerplate code, some HTML code. So this will be async await. This will be the title, and here we will load the main.js file. Pretty simple. And let's just show something here and open up the browser, and here we can see our console.log message, which is test. So that means this is working. So let's start with coding our examples. So before looking at the async await syntax, let's see some examples of the promise object. Basically, as the async await syntax uses promises. So let's create a simple function that is supposed to get some data. So first let's define the function name. It will be called character data. I will use the arrow syntax, arrow functions. So it will look something like this. In case you're not familiar with this, you can check my other video about ES6 syntax, but basically this is the same as doing this. Okay, so here we will return a promise, and the promise object takes a function as an argument, and this function should have two parameters, one called resolve and the other reject. These are the two functions that will be called when the promise is basically resolved or rejected. So the first thing I want to do is to create a new variable, so we basically can turn that on and off to know if the function fails, to simulate that it fails. So here, if there's an error, if there's no error, I will do something, and if there's an error, I will do something else. If there's no error, I want to simulate getting some data from, for example, a database. So let's create a timeout, set timeout, and here let's use the async await syntax, and here this will be called in 1 second, 1000 milliseconds, and we will call the resolve function here, and this will return the object that we will basically have the character data. So in this case I will use a character from the Rick and Morty show that's what I've been using in all my different example projects. So if there's no error, in 1 second this promise will resolve to this, and if there's an error, I will call reject, and let's say error getting data here. We can basically return anything in these functions. In this case I'm returning an object, but here it's just a string. So and now I'm getting an error because I forgot to close this parenthesis. But now I can call this function. And when we use functions that implement the promise object, we can basically use the then function or then method. And that's the method we can use to add our logic when the promise is resolved successfully. So it will be response. And here we just console.log the response. And if there's an error, we use the other method called catch. And here we'll get some kind of variable with the response or the error. And let's console.log this error here. And now let's refresh this page. And as we can see, we get the object we were basically trying to get, simulating that this will be some kind of request. And yeah, so that's a simple example. What if we have an error? We get the message from the reject the reject function here. Okay, so now let's see an example with the fetch API. So let's define a constant here, and I will use the Rick and Morty API. So I will get one character from that API. This endpoint basically gets the information from one character. And to use the fetch API, all I have to do is to, if I can type, all I have to do is pass the URL. And here we get the same methods that we have with the promise, because this is using promises, is returning a promise. So we can have here a response. Oops. And we get here a response. And we can return the response here and call this method called .json. So the fetch API requires that you call this method called JSON, because the first promise doesn't contain the data that we want. Usually just have the headers from the request. So instead you should basically call this method, and in the next .then that's when you actually get the data. So let's go here, data, and here let's console.log this data. And here we can see this is all the information related to that character. I think can make this smaller. So that's how you usually use the fetch API with promises. But what if there's an error? We can also use the same .catch method here. So if we got an error, we should process that error. But in this case, we are just gonna print the error. Let's make a bad request here, something that doesn't exist. So this endpoint should not exist. So we get an error. But this error is actually coming from the result. As you can see here, we are basically showing the data, and that's a response from the API. So this is one of the issues with the fetch API. Basically almost every request will be successful as long as there's no network error. So so in this case, if you want to really get to catch the error in the other method, the catch method, you will need to check for that response. And if the response is not okay, you need to throw an error here. And that will basically make the catch to be triggered. So instead of using this fetch API, what I like to do is use a library called Axios, which is, I think, very popular. So I will first add the Axios CDN here, so we can use the library. And now we can use the Axios API, so we can just pass the URL to this Axios function. By default, this will create a GET request, so we have access to the same .dem method, and here we can get a response. And the difference between Axios and fetch is that we don't really need to call the .json method. So here in this response should be the data that we want. But let's first fix this URL and refresh. And as you can see here, this is our data. So we can actually just console.log the data, and this is what we need really. And as in the fetch API, we also get access to the same methods, the catch, to get any error. And we can basically handle the errors here. Let's try to do the same bad request. And as we can see here, we got a 404, and that's coming from the catch, not from the response. So now let's create a new function to use the async await syntax. This one will be called get character location async, and this function will get a URL as a parameter, and here. So the first thing we need to make this function use the async await syntax is to add the async keyword here before the parameter, and we will define a constant here for the response from the request to the API, and here we will use the await keyword, and this is because we will use Axios here to call the URL. And let's console.log this response here. It's just the data. So this function will wait here for a response from this API, and until it gets that data from that API, it will not continue to this other line of code. So let's call the function here, and I need to pass the URL and refresh. And as we can see, we got the data from that character here. So if we were not using this await keyword, so the function will execute all the code without waiting for the response. So let's keep that await keyword there. And now what we want to do is to get some information from the location. Here we get this other endpoint. So we will use that to call this endpoint from another request. So let's create another constant called response2 await Axios, and in this case we will use response dot data dot location dot URL, and let's console.log this response to the data, and let's refresh here. And as we can see, we get these two responses here, and the second one is the location, all the information related to the location. And what if we wanted to create 3 different requests at the same time? What if we don't want to wait for one request to finish to do the other? So let's see an example for that case. So let's define a new constant called promise1. Let's use Axios here, and let's copy and paste the URL here. And let's copy this 2 times. This will be 1, this will be 2, this will be 3, will be 2, this will be 3. And we can use here the promise class and call all and pass here all the promises. Promise 1, promise 2, promise 3. So then the first function will be the values, and the second will be the reason if there's an error. So let's console.log these values and the reason. And let's run this code. And we got our data here. This is Rick, and this should be Maury. This is Maury, and let's see who is this one. This is Summer. And I forgot to mention something on the async await syntax, and is how you manage or you handle errors. And the way you do that is using the good old try and catch. So here we just wrap our code in try, catch, and that way if there's any kind of error here, we should get the some kind of message. Let's try something here. And here, as you can see, we get the error. And that's it for this video. If you found this video helpful, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.